Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Ignacio Arismendi from BRT Centre of Excellence, and I work there as community manager. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. Today we have Eduardo Vasconcellos from CAF, where he is the coordinator of the Latin American Mobility Observatory, and he will be our speaker. He will talk us about urban mobility in Latin America, reflections on the 2014 report of the OMU. After it, we will have time for some questions. So, if you have anyone, please write it down in the chat. Then we can see them later. Finally, I would like to conclude inviting you to join this monthly webinar. And if any one of you is interested to present here, please contact us with the email I'm writing in the chat pod. So Eduardo, the time is yours. Thank you for your presentation.
Okay, Ignacio. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us in this discussion. I will begin with a short explanation about what happened in Latin America in relation to mobility observatories. Until the end of the 1900 years, we did not have any major observatory on mobility, urban mobility, and we relied on the people that we knew to, for instance, to ask some friends in Buenos Aires, how many buses do you think you have in Buenos Aires? And so it was very, very difficult to organize all the studies and to provide public policies with good information. The first case of an observatory was in Brazil in 2003, when we organized an observatory for the 500 cities over 60,000 inhabitants in Brazil, where 60 to 70% of all major mobility occurs. And this was 2003. We have an annual report in Portuguese, which is our language. And later, about 5 or some years later, I was invited to help CAF to organize the Latin American Mobility Observatory that we are going to speak today. The OMU began with 15 cities in 2007, with 5 Brazilian cities and 10 Spanish-speaking cities. Nowadays, we already have 29 large areas in Latin America. And so this, for the first time, we were able to understand the characteristics of our mobility, urban mobility system, and therefore to have good information to improve not the quality of the decisions on public policies in Latin America, mobility policies. In addition to the OMU itself, CAF also published some reports on major issues related to the data that we analyzed. Beginning with the explanation in the first or second display, the 29 urban areas, we cover 12 countries. One is Brazil, and the other 11 ones are Spanish-speaking countries, with a total of 150 million inhabitants. Remember that we deal with major metropolitan areas, that including the small cities inside the metropolitan areas. There's a large fleet of automobiles, 35 million automobiles, and an increasing fleet of motorcycles, 7 million. And buses and microbuses that serves people with public transportation, almost 400,000, which is really very, very, very large. running from very, very small vehicles and old ones to sophisticated buses used in the new BRTs. The number of trips per day is almost 300 million people, 300 million trips, making a individual or private or personal mobility index of 1.9. 1.9 or 2 trips per person per day is typical of developing countries. In Africa, it's only 1 trip per person, and in countries, very rich countries, the number of trips per day per person increases to around 4 trips per day. The second one, the data that we have is still limited because most societies did not involve themselves with collecting all the information. So CAF had to hire local experts who were the people that knew where the data were. So these people helped us for 2 years to gather and to sort of clean all the informations that were available. It took us 2 years to get to the information that we have now. We have infrastructure, information on roads, traffic signals, and bus or bike priorities, and also the private and the public vehicles that are used, as I mentioned before, and with the energy that they use, the taxes that they have to pay, and all the informations. At the economic side, we have a very important information on the minimum wage, which we will relate later, eventually to the capacity of using public transportation, the gross product of the country, and the exchange rates. So we may talk about dollars instead of 29 different currencies. The information on mobility is especially the trips per mode and per energy used, which will allow us to compute some information in the other side. In public transportation, the major information is institutional organization and regulation. I don't know if you are all familiar with this, but most of the Latin American countries still have unregulated or weakly regulated or weakly regulated public transportation systems. This means that the state decided that public transport was not a public issue, but instead a private issue. So in most countries, you still have small vehicles, unregulated, run by individuals who own the vehicles, with very light, very simple rules to follow, just to prove that the driver has a driver license and basically nothing else. In Brazil, we have a completely different system. We have, in the last 55 decades, a regulated system where enterprises are contracted to run the buses under contracts. And so there are a lot of regulation in the Brazilian side. Nowadays, we are facing a type of a changing in the other countries towards the Brazilian regulated system. We see in several countries parts of the public transportation system being regulated in some ways, mimicking the system of Brazil. And we have been having a big debate whether this is going to be good or bad. We have the numbers of vehicles, their capacity, the energy they used, and also we estimate the emissions using either the information from the local universities or expert people who analyze and study the environmental side of the issue. And when we do not have the local information, we use the information from the corporate system, which is now used all over the world, trying to approach the actual emissions in each country. Another very important information, of course, are the fares who are charged from the users, who has discounts, and where there are subsidies. Some of the cities, as I will show you later, they have subsidies to support the operation of the systems. And how many people work in the system, which is very important to know in the case of the economy. At traffic management, we asked for some information on special operations like license plates that we have in Brazil and also in Colombia, in Chile, etc. Reversible lanes, for instance, and also road safety, which is a very difficult issue to explain once, historically speaking, the states did not worry about getting good information on road safety. How do we do the analysis? We use the mobility metabolism that I have suggested in 2007 in a paper published by the Journal of Transport Geography. And we analyzed basically two groups. The first group is the use, the consumption. So we analyzed the individual expenses per mode, how much money people pay to have their system running or to pay to use public transportation. The travel time per mode, the distance run per mode, and the energy used per mode. This will allow us to understand how much money people have to spend, how much time do they spend to travel, and how much public space, road space, people use by running in different vehicles. Of course, people walking use just 1 square meter per person. People using automobiles use at least 10 times more public space in the case of Latin America without paying anything for an extra space. And also the consumptions of energy. Most countries do not have the energy. They have to buy energy, and this is a very important costs for them to import petroleum, import gases, and so on. So energy has to be very carefully understood. The impacts. There are several impacts of mobility. In our cases, we decided to analyze emissions, not only local or criteria pollutants that harm our health, but also the CO2, the greenhouse effect emissions per mode, and traffic safety, which is a very severe problem in Latin America. We did not, for instance, study the sound or the impacts on the sound of the traffic and other impacts that we do not have the information to do this. In the case of this graph, the modal share in 2014 for the 29 cities shows a total of 75 million trips per day on foot and bicycles, 93 million trips per day on private transportation, which means automobiles and motorcycles, and 120,000 trips per day or million trips per day on public transportation, both buses and rail and metros. Well, this is a huge number of trips per day. But as I said before, there is a medium individual mobility of 1.9 trips per day, which means that 42% are public transportation and 32% already automobiles and motorcycles, and only 26% on non-motorized or active. transportation. The other one is trips per day per type of vehicle. And here you see, for instance, that the automobiles and motorcycles on the left, the individual, automobiles especially a large number of trips, but motorcycles are increasing rapidly in Latin America, and in the future we will probably see much more larger number of trips on motorcycles. On the right-hand side, the basic bus, the standard bus with about 30 to 40 seats is the most used vehicle with almost 70% of the trips inside the world of public transportation trips. The other one is just an idea, a very simple idea of a corridor in São Paulo and the average road space used. And you see that the buses in the red lines, they occupy a very, very small part of the major roads, about 15%. And they carry the double of the number of people inside the automobiles. The private transportation uses much more space, road space, along the day, several times higher than the space that used by public transportation, and private transportation carries much less people. Following, see, this is a very important discussion because it relates the out-of-pocket cost of using three available modes in Latin American cities to run the vehicle for 7 kilometers. Buses, automobiles, and motorcycles. This is the cost, out-of-pocket cost. For the buses, this is just the fare, the basic fare of the standard bus, which is the most used bus in Latin America. And in the side of the motorcycles and automobile is just the fuel that is used to run the motorcycle or the automobile for 7 kilometers. We did not include the cost of parking, obviously for motorcycles because they do not have to pay anything, but we also did not include the cost for parking in automobiles because according to our information, basically 90% of the automobiles in Brazil and in other countries never have to pay to park on public roads, which is a basic problem of our public policies in mobility. So the cost of running an automobile is basically the cost of gasoline. And we conclude that the cost of using a motorcycle, which is in red, is much lower than using the bus. And it's very important, the second consequence is that the cost of using an automobile is basically equal to the cost of using a bus, which means that the bus is the worst system to use, and nobody will get off the motorcycle or will get off the automobile and go inside the bus because it would be completely absurd for the person because the cost is either lower or the same of the bus. We will speak about this more later. The other one is the cost of, excuse me, just wait a minute. The cost of comparing the cost of a person that has to pay the bus fares for 30 days, for the whole month. And we compare, I'm having a problem here just to go to the next slide. Just wait a minute, please. Okay, let's go. please. Well, something. Well, the next slide. Unfortunately, I'm having. Okay, let's go back. It's this one. Cost of 50 monthly bus fares as compared to minimum wages. This is very important for us because people have to have the money to pay for the bus. A lot of people do not have the money to pay in most countries, including in Brazil. So you may see that this is the two years that we used in the system. It's 2007 and 2014. The ideal rate of the cost of 50 fares against the minimum salary would be 6%. So it would be ideal that people expend no more than 6% of their income with the cost of 50 their salaries. But actually, the people have to pay from 10 to 20% of their salaries, the minimum wages, to pay for the cost of the bus, which means it's a very big burden on the income of the person. And that's why a lot of people in Latin America, including in Brazil, they are immobile because they have no money to pay for the system. The other one, I think, are you okay? Cities with subsidies to public transportation. This is also very important. And we have a lot of cities with public transportation, but mostly public transportation subsidies are related to rail systems. The major case of non-rail system, which means bus systems, is São Paulo, which has a real, very big $1 billion a year subsidies to run the buses. In most cases, they are related to the rail system. Among the 29 cities, Buenos Aires is by far the city that has the largest percent of subsidies to systems, because in Buenos Aires, both the bus system, which is large, and the rail system, which is also very large, both receive subsidies from the government. This is not wrong per se. I believe that we have to subsidize the system with public transportation for social, economic, and environmental issues, but we have to be very sincere in saying that we have been giving some subsidies that should not be given in some cases. So we would have to understand or to reanalyze the cities that are receiving, the systems that are receiving. The next one is space and time used by modes. For instance, the automobile and the taxi, they occupy 75% of the road space. And people inside automobiles and taxis, they spend just 27% of the total time that is spent by everybody. Motorcycles occupy a less quantity of space and a small number of hours. But buses occupy just 12% of the space and carry and people inside the buses, they spend the double of the proportion of the time used in automobiles, because buses, the speed of buses are very mostly low, below 14 kilometers an hour, when it should be at least 20 kilometers an hour. The other one is energy by type of vehicle in percentage. You see, the automobile expends 53% uses of all energy in the 29 cities, which is much, much higher than all the other vehicles, which means that the consumption of energy is highly concentrated on automobiles. And in the right side of the slide, there is a estimate of the energy per trip. So the energy per trip on private transportation is more than the double of the energy per trip in public transportation. The other one is local pollutants, criteria pollutants, carbon monoxide, hydrocarbons, etc., and particulate matter. In blue, there is the emissions of carbon monoxide, that you see that there's a lot of emissions both by public and private transportation. And especially in the case of the particulate matters, most of them come from the diesel engines and the low quality of the diesel energy that we have in Latin America. If you go to the other one, for CO2 emissions, 43% of CO2 emissions are done by the automobiles and 17% by motorcycles and 11% by taxis, which means that basically 72% of CO2 emissions comes from the three private motorized means: automobiles, motorcycles, and taxis, and just 28% of the diesel buses. Going to the road fatalities, which is a very, very severe problem in Latin America. You see on the left slide that road fatalities, 47% are pedestrians, 31% are now motorcycles, 17% automobiles, and just 5% are cyclists. The total number of fatalities, 7,577 people died in 2014 in the 29 cities. And the right-hand side, you see the road fatalities per 100,000 people, which is the most important way of measuring the problem. And you see that the red line, the average in Europe, is about 2 to 3 fatalities per 100,000 people, and Latin America is around 10 to 15, which is 5 to 7 times higher. We still have a very, very bad rate of fatalities in mobility, urban mobility. This one shows something that I see as very important that we do not find in other observatories, is that how much money was invested in the mobility system in the past. Now, here we estimate how much money was invested in roads, in rail, in BRT, in public vehicles, in automobiles, and in motorcycles. How did we do this? We do not have the historical information about the cost, but so we imagined that how much the society would have to invest if all the roads, the rails, the BRTs were built now in 2014, and also the public vehicles, the automobiles, and the motorcycles would have been purchased in 2014, as everything was brand new. You know, and the number is almost $1 trillion. It's really very, very high. And when you go to the level of one of the 29 cities, the assets, the mobility assets in roads, infrastructure, and vehicles is similar to the city gross product, yearly gross product, which means that society invested a lot of money to have the mobility system operating. most of the, the information is private vehicles, which means that society spent a lot of money buying private vehicles. Why? This is another question that everybody has to think about. But I think that this is one of the most important discussions for us. The other one is about we were asking ourselves, did the bus fare increase more than the minimum wages in the countries or not? Because remember, the public transportation system, except in Brazil, is mostly deregulated. So the fare could change according to market rules. But in practice, what happens is that the fares, they do change, but they never, they change in the same rate that the minimum wages change, which means that the political system, instead, the political system do not control the public transportation systems. They are deregulated. But in the case of wages, in the case of fares, it appears that the public, the system, the public system, or the society, or the government does not allow bus fares to increase more than wages, which is a sort of worry of the politicians with what would happen with people. Going to the private fleets, it's very important to understand that between 2007 and 2014, there was a 48% increase. 11 additional automobiles were included in the 29 cities. And with motorcycles, the increase was 153%. 4 million extra motorcycles. And this is running exponentially. The annual rate of increasing the automobiles is about 4%, which is very high. And in motorcycles, the annual increase is 13% a year, which is really, really, really big. Some good news, at least. Well, priority to cyclists. I mean, cycling lanes and also completely separated from traffic, they have been increasing at a very high rate. Between 2004 and 2007, they tripled from 1,000 kilometers to priorities to cyclists to more than 3,000 kilometers. But instead of this huge increase, they are the availability of bicycle priority is limited to 1–2% of roads, which is really very small. And the right side, priority to buses, have also been increasing and doubled between 2007 and 2014, but they are available only in less than 1% of the roads. I'm not saying that bus would have to have 100% or priority in 100% of the roads, but this less than 1% is really ridiculous. Even Curitiba, that we praise for several motives, is just 4 or 5% of the roads who do have priority. Going to the final part, this is very, very difficult to define which is more or less important to point out, but I selected seven items that I think are very important to analyze and discuss the future of mobility in Latin American cities. First of all, exponential increases in the number of automobiles and motorcycles, which means exponential increase in the use of the space, the road space, which is very expensive for society, and also the increase in pollution, and because of motorcycles, the increase in fatalities, unfortunately. The second one, as I said, is increasing congestion and pollution. You now see in several cities in Brazil a huge congestion being created And also in several large cities in Latin America, there's a huge congestion. Number three, the private transport has a very, very high consumption of space, as I said. Automobiles occupy more than 10% of the space than the other. And if you go to a large avenue, as I said, in Brazil, basically 2/3 of the space, or even more, is used by automobiles and their impacts. Number four, there's a weak regulation of public transport and low quality. This is related to the history of Latin America, of informal, unregulated systems. And now in this point, I remember the book, the famous book of Schumacher, asking if, or saying that small is beautiful. And in this very specific case, I tend to not agree with him, because most of the informal, unregulated systems, they are very, very low quality ones. They are market systems that adapted themselves to the reality of the countries. And we are really poor countries, but we do not have equitable systems. We have very unfair systems. So we do have to understand that we should support the public transportation systems with subsidies, in my opinion. And also we should reanalyze the public transportation systems and try to formalize it, in my opinion, to some way. And in order to understand that the public transportation system is not a private issue, but instead it is a public issue that has to be in some ways organized and controlled by the state, not operated by, organized and controlled. Number five, fare costs are still too high to the average wages. Basically speaking, 1/3 of our population do not have money to pay to use the buses every day. It's very, very serious for us. In the case of our economic, we should ask, instead of saying that we do not have money, we should ask, how is the cost for our societies of having children that does not go to school because the parents have no money to pay for the bus? This is a tremendous cost for society to have an illiterate children. And what is the cost of young people that is unable to have a good job because it has no money to pay for the fares? This is much more costly for society than the saying that we have no money. We do have a lot of money, and it has been used to subsidize the use of the automobiles. Number six, still have a high quantity of road fatalities. And number seven, which is very difficult, auto users do not pay for social and environmental costs in none of the countries in Latin America. Oh, I think that this is enough for now, and I'm open to ask to answer to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo, for this great presentation. Now we have time for some questions, as you said, or discussion if you want. You can write it in the chat pod.
Okay, should I wait?
People is writing.
Should I wait or read the question?
Read if you want.
Well, I understand that the first one was from Henrik Goodmundson, right? Are the low costs for driving motorcycles and cars due to fuel subsidies? I may, Henry, thank you for the question. In the case of Brazil, this is very, very clear. The Brazilian elite has always subsidized gasoline for automobile users because they think that this is that is very important to support the automobile industry and the middle class because they are the creators of wealth. And I really do not accept this. But anyway, every time, in the case of Brazil, when cost of oil increased and we would have to increase the cost of the gasoline here for the people, the government allowed the cost of the diesel running buses to increase and did not allow the cost of gasolines for the cars, which is really crazy. So in other countries in Latin America, we also see some subsidies of the gasoline to support people running automobiles. Anyway, but in my opinion, and I have been analyzing this in the case of Brazil, one of the most important subsidies that is given to automobile users in all Latin America, it's kind of a hidden, indirect subsidy, is to provide free parking in public roads. As I said, for instance, in São Paulo, in one single day, 1 million automobiles park for free in public roads. And this implies an annual, in the city of São Paulo, 1 million automobiles per day. This implies a hidden subsidy of $1 billion a year. If we charge these people that park their cars for free every day, all the year, just $3 for parking, we would be able to double the number of metro lines that we have in just 4 or 5 years. So when we think that we are poor, okay, Latin American countries are not highly developed countries, but they are, most of them, industrialized. So we do have a lot of money to improve the mobility system if we stop subsidizing directly and indirectly the use of the automobile. Well, the second one, I believe, is from Yorgos. Right? Am I right? This is the second question?
Yes.
Okay, Yorgos, how are you? Okay, latest data from 2014. How much is reflected in the study, the penetration of the new technologies, hybrid electric vehicles, which sectors seek to adopt faster these technologies? Okay, we did not capture, Yorgos, any major change because some of the cities already have hybrid buses. Very, very few have electric buses, still have. So I think that another report in 5 years, for instance, 2019 or 2020, would show a very important change in Brazil, in Colombia, in Chile, etc. But the 2014 report did not reveal any major change on this particular case. Right? What system will adopt faster these technologies in every 5 years? I think that the bus system is going to do this. Okay, I think that both the hybrid buses, the buses run by natural gas, and the battery bus, they will really be a very important component of the public transportation system in the next 5 to 10 years. I do believe it, and we also in CAF we did a major analysis of what would be the decrease in emissions if we were able to replace the current 100,000 buses we have now in Latin America in these cities, 100,000. If we replace them with hybrid buses, gas buses, and so on, it will be published, I think, in 2 or 3 months by CAF. And it is really, really major decrease in emissions of the old buses that we have. So I think society is for it, and several governments are interested in doing this. So I do believe that this is going to occur. Jorge Espinosa, if we can go back to the slide with the relative out of pocket. Okay, let's go there. If my computer is sort of. Jorge, please wait for some time. Okay, that's. Okay, that's relative out of pocket. Okay, Jorge? Which are your questions? Okay, I'm waiting for your. Okay, Jorge, my questions along with the question that Caracas, yes. Caracas, it's very easy to understand because the price of the gasoline is zero, right? It's a few cents. It has been in the last decades. So it's really the cost of running the automobile in Caracas is close to zero if you do have the automobile, right? So that's why it's really very, very, very non-expensive. And also Santa Cruz de la Sierra has the same phenomenon by some ways. Okay, if you are interested in the CAF site, we have the Excel information with the files in Excel with information. If you do not find them, please call me again, right? But Caracas is amazing, right? Caracas has oil production and Santa Fe has a lot of subsidies. Nevertheless, the usage is different on the modes. Yes, exactly now I cannot answer with details your question, but I may analyze it for you later if you want, right? And see if there is any further information that could. Okay, thank you very much. Why would you say is that happening? Are you asking about Caracas again, or? Well, let me go first to the Elise Lewis question. Within the current data set, to what extent are the private bus systems, micros and and camionetas considered compared to public systems. All the vehicles used, were analyzed per se. We have specific data for very small vehicles like vans, microbuses, all the types of vehicles. We have different information, but they belong, we consider that they belong to the whole public transportation system. Here, you see aggregated information on public transportation systems, separated, I mean, the bus vehicles, we mean tire buses, right? And the rail systems. That generally speaking, in our report, they are separated by two worlds, the bus world and the rail world. But inside the bus world, you will find several information on the type of vehicles, with the energy they spend, the space they use, and so on and so on and so on, in the annexes of the report and in the Excel file available in the internet. Okay? Let me see. And Henry Goodmunso again. I will go back to what's the ideal and what is realistic frequency to update the data. It's a very good question. Nowadays, I would say that it's realistic to update several information every year. I'm talking about the type of information which is already public, like the fleet that is available, the number of lines, the fare, the discounts, and there are several information among the 100 information that we have. Some of them nowadays are available either in the internet or in the new organizations, public organizations that now control mobility. So it's much better than it was 10 or 15 years ago. But a lot of information you will not get because most of the systems are still informal. The government has no people working with it, and the information belongs to the owner of the buses, and most of them do not want to speak about their figures. They do not want to explain to you how it happens. But it's much better than it was before, so I'm very optimistic that maybe in 5 or 10 years we will be able to publish the report every year. If CAF wants to do this, it will also be a decision in CAF. In the case of Brazilian Observatory, we do have the information because the Brazilian system is regulated, as I said in the beginning. So ANTP in Brazil, where I coordinated the Brazilian Observatory, we publish annual reports. Okay, so but they are in Portuguese. It's very difficult for a lot of people to understand, right? Yorgos, one more question. Trip on foot. Okay. How do you define trip on foot? In this case, Yorgos, we had to use the origin destination survey information, which is not the better one. Okay, I'm thinking you are talking about. These are the pedestrian, the walking trips per se, which means that the person just walked from point A to point B. Okay, in this particular case, we did not include the people walking from their homes to the bus stop, for instance, and getting off the bus and going to the office to work. We did not include this here. And also, we were not able to include the very short walking trips, because most of the origin destination surveys only collects walking trips beginning with 400 or 500 meters. Only the origin destination service from Bogota and Montevideo, they did count all the information, but the other they do not. So we remain with the basic information on pedestrian-only trip from point A from point B. This is not good, because if you are going to analyze for instance, the risk of being involved, the pedestrian being involved in an accident, comparing the number of accidents with the kilometers run, you have a problem, because we are not talking about all the kilometers that are really walked. We are just talking about the trips made by foot. Okay, so that's a problem that we face. Let me see if there's any other. Okay, Álvaro, the regulation in Brazil versus the deregulation in the rest of that does not guarantee higher priority levels to public transport. How do you find this the better approach to provide more space to public advice? Okay, Álvaro, the regulation in Brazil does not guarantee higher priority. Yes, it's okay, but when you have a regulated system with several, with contracts, with rights and duties that we do have in Brazil, there is much more space for you to discuss with the bus providers how to do technological improvements, priorities, and so on. So I, as a Brazilian, I am used to this system, and I'm not saying this is perfect. For instance, the Brazilian system has a lot of good things, because it regulates, and then you know exactly the lines, you know the frequency, you know the vehicles that are going to run. The drivers and the fare collectors, they are hired people with social rights and vacations and so on and so on and so on. But the Brazilian system created huge monopolies, geographical monopolies, which threatens the power of the state. But in general terms, we do have much more conditions to define priority and to discuss with the private operators than if you were in a system completely informal, where there is no rules for anything. So I still believe that it would be better for Latin America to move towards the Brazilian system, trying to overcome the problems that we have here. Of course, it's not perfect. Roberto, an additional way of reducing polynomial costs, weekly, monthly passes. This would be an easy way to simulate. Yes, Roberto, it's very similar to Álvaro's question, because in Brazil we do have the power to do this. We do have the power to negotiate with all the authorities. All the authorities have the power to regulate and to talk and to discuss with the private operators. And several cities in Brazil have been creating several weekly passes or monthly passes or something. And also because we do have all the systems are electronically connected and integrated and so on. And this would be very, very difficult to do in an informal system. It's very, very difficult to do. So only in Brazil this is possible now, or in the case of the large new BRTs that, for instance, are running in Mexico, in Colombia, etc. Very, very good systems. So they have more control, but they do not control the city. There are always thousands of small buses unregulated, and you cannot integrate them with the regulated buses in the BRTs and so on. So I still believe that the Brazilian system is better. Okay, this is I have been arguing for this in Latin America, despite the problems that we have with the Brazilian system. Liz Lewis, if you collect more data about the private systems, what would you consider to be most useful? What you want to collect? Private systems. I do not see, Elise, any major information that we should add to the private systems, because we already have the number of trips, how many kilometers, the time, and you are able to calculate the space they use, the energy they use. Okay, in an ideal world. Well, one information that is not exactly an information, but one thing that we have been struggling with is to understand better what would do the private transportation people that use automobiles. What would convince them to move to public transportation? But, and we do not have a lot of information about this, so that would be a first idea. Right? And then we would organize a new system that would decrease the number of people using automobiles or the distance running and moving them to active transportation or to bus transportation. Ricardo, hello Eduardo. What has been the experience lately with bus-only lanes and bus-exclusive lanes, not corridors? Are they still being considered as efficient way? Well, this is a good question. I believe that in every city you have to have several levels of priority. And for instance, in São Paulo we have several types, and if you have a good design and a good operation, all the subsystems, all the ways that you provide some exclusivity or priority, they will occur. For instance, the latest information on São Paulo, the best corridors with really physically separated and more controlled, they run at about 23 to 24 kilometers an hour, which is quite good, not good as Transmilenio. And the bus-only lanes in São Paulo, they are just 4 kilometers an hour inferior. They run at from 18 to 20 kilometers an hour. But they are not as good as the real corridors, but they are much better than the regular bus running in other roads in São Paulo, other streets in São Paulo, that are running at 12 kilometers an hour. So there are space, in my opinion, for 2 or 3 levels of priority, but they have to be designed and controlled. That's very important, because a lot of people invade the space, do not respect, and so on. So I'm not saying, I do not believe that a system in the future will have thousands of kilometers of BRTs, but anyway, it will have, but in the other way, we will have a mixed system of priorities depending on the level of flood of the number of passengers and buses.
Okay, there are no more questions. Thank you everyone for your questions. Thank you, Eduardo, for your answers, for your presentation. Remember, we will see you in our next monthly webinar. So that's all. Goodbye, everyone.
Okay. Thank you very much for joining us. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and please visit the CAF site or the ANTP in Brazil. And if you need any further information, please contact us. Okay?
Thank you, Eduardo.
Thank you for all.